Hello, I'm Ted Morrissey, and I'm making a video for my revisionist Shakespeare class. I'm going to read to you for just a bit to start things off here. This is the story of Ella Bend Hess, of how she became clairvoyant and what she was able to see. There was nothing in her childhood to suggest it. Her gift was the gift of the gods. Not a natural product of her past, I'm sure of that. It was a true gift, free and undeserved as beauty is supposed to be, or the descent of the dove, inexplicable and merciless. Marvelous is what I mean. Miraculous. Mysterious? Surely not a word so weak. Yet it has to begin with an M. You see how little pride I have to let you watch me fumble. I could have sent that wretched word away and written what I wanted. You'd have been no wiser. But I haven't got that kind of courage anymore, the courage of the liar. My will somewhere along the way has grown most deathly tired. Now I have the scruples of a worn out thief, fierce, painful scruples, and I wish I could recover everything I've stolen from my stories over the years. Maybe then my angry blood would be quiet. Of course, they do catch up, these phrases that I've condemned, poor, awkward creatures, and occupy my dreams. They remind me of a row of prisoners rapping on their bars. They shout their names and shout their names. I laugh with all my nerves. Well, prison is my only metaphor. Is it right or honest? After all, Ella Bend, where is she? Isn't she as much in all those scraps I threw away as the scraps I saved? Threw away, mind you, when they held her name. Where else did she have her life? I'd have given her a long nose, I remember. No good reason why. Now her nose is middling. I made her sing a bawdy song. A poor idea. And I cut the nursery scene entirely. The whole scene, you understand, where she comes in more than half asleep, the baby bawling, frightened, pawing at the darkness, helpless as a beetle on its back. When Ella touches him, she shares his skin and feels him stiffen. Just then she understands the dreadful quality of his confusion. Her mouth falls open. She strikes the air. I've never had the experience myself. How would it be to bump things like a spider? Anyway, there were too many principles against the passage. I didn't give her a long nose exactly. She had a long nose. Now it's gone. I decided she looked too much like a witch, and since she really was a witch, it wouldn't do to have her look precisely like one. If I weren't honest, you'd never know. You'd think her nose was middling. So it is. My God, don't blame poor authors. Think how shameful it would be to say, Ella Bend had a long nose, which I shortened to a middling one because a middling one made her look less like a witch, although a witch is what she was. You won't find many who have got the guts. They make a cheap product, skimp on the goods. If you want my advice, don't buy. Okay, that is the opening to Cartesian Sonata, a novella, and the first section is called The Writing on the Wall, and it is part of the master, William H. Gass's novella, collection of novellas, Cartesian Sonata. And I wanted to start with that because we are talking about this book, The Gap of Time by Jeanette Winterson. And specifically, I wanted to focus on aspect of the novel that several of you didn't really find to taste. And that, of course, is the author, Jeanette Winterson, inserting herself into the narrative of the story and commenting on her own novel, commenting on Shakespeare's play as the author within the context of the novel. And like I said, some of you are okay with that. Some of you took exception to that. But it is a type of writing, a type of fiction. It oftentimes is called metafiction, and another good reason to start with the master is because Gass is credited with coining that term back in the, mid part of the 20th century. And that section I read to you was definitely metafictive. The author is writing the story and is letting you know that they're writing the story as they're writing the story. Gass claims that he could have just deleted some detail, but instead he leaves it on the page and comments about why he would have deleted it if he wanted to, etc. And that, of course, that's just one sort of variation of of metafiction. And one sort of kind of loosey-goosey definition of metafiction is that it's writing about writing. So it's fiction based on the act of writing fiction, essentially. And uh, it's not necessarily new. It wasn't new when the postmodernists were embracing it so lovingly in the, in the 70s and 80s and onward, 1970s and 80s, I guess I should clarify. Um, and so when Jeanette Winterson does it in A Gap of Time, it's not a brand new kind of invention, certainly. One way of thinking of it is the breaking of the fourth wall, right? Where the author kind of breaks the narrative dream that the reader is been kind of seduced into by letting them know, hey, here I am, the author, and I'm writing this story, and now I'm going to talk to you sort of directly. Um, like I said, it was particularly popular in the postmodern era, which we associate with the latter half of the 20th century. Um, I think of writers like Kurt Vonnegut Jr., who does it several places, but in Breakfast of Champions in particular, uh, he Vonnegut had invented a kind of alter ego, a science fiction writer named Kilgore Trout, and Kilgore Trout is talked about in several of Vonnegut's books, but Kilgore Trout is the main character of Breakfast of Champions. And it's been a long time since I've read it, but essentially Kilgore Trout is traveling cross country, goes into a bar, and as he's kind of ordering his drink and waiting for it to be brought to him, he gets the sense that someone is watching him. And as he kind of scans the bar, he discovers it's Vonnegut, the author who created him. So he goes over to Vonnegut's table and sits there and has a conversation with his author, the creator of him, criticizing him at times for the sloppy plot development that Vonnegut is using in the novel, that kind of thing. Again, very, very kind of popular. John Barth, another postmodern author of the same era, in the collection Chimera, has a sort of revisionist take on 1001 Arabian Nights. And in that, John Barth sort of materializes into ancient Persia as if a genie from a lamp, and then has a conversation with his characters in that particular story. Like I said, lots and lots of examples out there. But even though the postmodernists embraced it and used it a lot, it wasn't new, certainly. If we think of live performance, oftentimes actors in live performance or reciters of stories would break the fourth wall, as we would call it. I think of, for example, the Beowulf poet. As you know, I brought all these books in here. I guess I can bring them out as I'm talking about these things. There's John Barth, Chimera. It happens in there, believe me. But then the Beowulf poet, as he is telling the tale of Beowulf and the monsters that Beowulf has to fight, and all of the palace intrigue, so to speak, going on in King Hrothgar's court and so on. A few times, the Beowulf poet slips out of narrative and speaks directly to his listeners. On one occasion, he talks to them about a moral lesson that they should be learning from that particular part of the story about, being true and faithful to the Christian God and not slipping back into their pagan ways like the characters in the poem do. At another point, very meta-fictive, meta-narrative, the poet kind of slips out of the storyline to give a little lesson on storytelling and how to tell a really good story, and just sort of slips that little lesson in the midst of things and then gets back into the storytelling. So the Beowulf poet was doing it, we don't even know, maybe around the year 725 or so, who knows. I also think of this character, Homer. If you're familiar with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, you may recall that in the Odyssey, when Odysseus the Wanderer who is trying to get back home when he ends up in Phaeacia and is invited into King Alcanuus's palace to have a meal. They don't know who he is yet. They don't know that he's Odysseus yet. But during the meal, King Alcanuus's poet, his storyteller, tells the story of the Trojan War. And Odysseus is moved to tears by hearing the story of the conflict and all of his friends and colleagues who were killed during the Trojan War and all the terrible things that befell them. But here's the thing: the story that the performer, the poet, is telling in King Alcanuus's court in the Odyssey is a story very reminiscent of the Iliad, which of course Homer also probably perhaps penned. And so one way of looking at it is that Homer inserted himself into the narrative of the Odyssey there in King Alcanuus's court and is telling the tale of the Iliad to Odysseus, who then has this emotional reaction to it. Again, jumping a few steps there, and it's not crystal clear that's what's happening, but the text is 3,000 years old, so you have to make some guesses here and there, right? So perhaps Homer was doing it in a sense, 3,000 years ago, but certainly the Beowulf poet was around the year 700 or so, and like I said, we can find lots and lots of examples. It's appropriate that Winterson would have been doing it in her revision of The Winter's Tale, because we know that in Shakespeare's day that the actors would routinely break the fourth wall, if you will, and interact with patrons watching the plays. It would vary from performance to performance, probably. If you're familiar with Macbeth, there's a long kind of comedic scene where the drunken porter, is making his way slowly to the palace gate to open it up for what we'll discover is Macduff, who has come to wake up King Duncan, which proves a lot harder than he anticipated. But the porter scene, we have the text in the play, but a lot of scholars believe that was probably an improvisational scene, that the comedic actor in Shakespeare's troupe, the King's Men, that each performance that would be somewhat different, that the actor would interact with the audience improvisationally, so how individual people attending the play reacted would then obviously change his reaction, change the text somehow or another, probably bringing inserting contemporary news events, perhaps. So if the play were performed, on a particular day and then not performed again for another month or 6 months or whatever it might be, that scene would change because the actor would be bringing in more relevant, more current kinds of events, again playing off of the audience and so forth. So that clearly was a way of just sort of coming out of the dream of the play, right? And just being upfront with the audience. You're watching a made-up story, a made-up production, and now I'm interacting with you directly. The Shakespearean stage was bare bones anyway. We today think of theater sometimes as being very elaborate. I'm sure you've been to live productions where they have very complex and complicated sets with maybe lots of moving parts, maybe lots of pyrotechnics and sound effects and all kinds of things happening. Maybe between acts, the curtain will come down, and behind the curtain, the crew will be moving things around and creating a new set and so forth. And then the curtain comes back up, and we're now someplace else, some other elaborate scene or whatever. But Shakespearean theater was much more bare bones than that. There really wasn't much in the way of a set. If a scene absolutely had to have a table or a chair or a set of chairs or whatever it might be, the actors in that particular scene would literally carry them onto the stage, in full view of the audience, set them down, perform the scene, pick them up, and walk off with them. So there was no dropping of a curtain and changing the set and so forth. Much more reliance was put on the imagination of the theater goers. to imagine what things were supposed to be like. So oftentimes you have a change of scene, like in Othello, for example, when we go from Venice, to the scene of the battle, elsewhere. The set doesn't change, right? It's just that we know that what's going on in the story, so now we know that we're here instead of there, right? And so there's no elaborate, stage change, no backdrop that comes down or something like that. So again, we know in Shakespeare's day, the actors routinely would kind of interact with the audience members. Just very recently, I saw the play Fairview. I wrote a review of it, which I think I shared with you, and Fairview, I'm not going to say much about it because, like I say in the review, if you see the production, its effect would, I think, very much be diminished by knowing too much about what the play is about beforehand. But I will say that there's in the play eventually there are some actors who know that they are actors in a play interacting with actors who are just the characters in the play. So like the characters who know that they're in a play, they will interact with the audience, they'll interact with the stage manager, ask for a spotlight to be turned on or something. But the other actors in that scene, the other characters, they don't know what's going on. It's this weird thing that's happening, and they don't know why this person is behaving the way that they are. So some of the actors are breaking the fourth wall and interacting with either the crew or the patrons, seeing the play, while others don't. So that's all kind of a metafictional, meta narrative or whatever. And I think the effect is to bring the audience into the action of the play. Another good example I was thinking of, there's a gentleman named Gerald Charles Dickens. You can look him up. I just did to make sure he's still alive and well, because I saw him years and years ago, maybe 20 years ago. He came to the area to do a one-man performance of his great-great-grandfather's A Christmas Carol. Gerald Dickens is an actor and producer and so forth in England, but he was doing this one-man performance of A Christmas Carol. Very, very good. But again, very bare bones set. It was an experimental kind of staging area. We were kind of sitting in an oval around him as he did his thing. And again, it's been a long time. Basically, there was just like a chair and a desk and like a coat rack with a top hat and a scarf and a walking stick or whatever. And that was pretty much it. It was just him and those few props and the audience. And he did the whole story, from stem to stern, just by himself. But I'm sure you've seen it or read it, that after Scrooge's transformation, he wakes up on Christmas Day and he's a new man, and he goes out into the streets of London and he's full of, of joy and vigor, and he's wishing people good morning and Merry Christmas and on and on and on. Well, when that part of the story comes along, Gerald Dickens, the actor, he goes into the audience and starts shaking all of our hands and wishing us Merry Christmas. And so now suddenly we are, the Londoners on Christmas morning, in Victorian England and so forth. So anyway, breaking the fourth wall can be very effective, and the way that writers do it is by, just sort of coming out of the novel or the story and speaking directly to the audience, to the reader, I should say, or letting them in on the process of writing the story and why they did this versus that, and so on. Again, I like that sort of thing. I was definitely raised on that. Like I said, it was very popular in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and that's when I was, kind of coming of age as a mature reader. And so I read a lot of Vonnegut and Barth and other writers who were very much into metafictive techniques and so forth. But the other thing that I want to say about Winterson's doing it in The Gap of Time is it is definitely a metafictional moment. But the other thing that she's doing there is combining genres. So obviously you've got the novel that she has, written as a revised version of The Winter's Tale. But there's also this nonfiction, almost like critical analysis kind of thing happening as well, where she, is commenting on The Winter's Tale and its impact on her and so forth. And again, kind of just weaving those two very different kinds of things, sort of kind of quasi-literary analysis with the actual novel that she's writing. So this combination of genres. I think I've mentioned Tolstoy's War and Peace before in other contexts, but we call War and Peace a novel, but it's kind of called that for lack of a better word, because it's not just a narrative, a made-up narrative based on the Napoleonic Wars. There are numerous insertions in the text where Tolstoy is being a historian and is giving us very accurate descriptions of historical events, particularly battles that took place, and analyzing them as a historian, as why this should have been done versus that, or what was the effect of this general, making this decision at this moment in the battle. And so there are these historical insertions in the text. As we know, Tolstoy had a lot of philosophical ideas about Christianity and about morals and how people should be treated and in different stratas of society and all those kinds of things. Well, he inserts that into the text as well, and not just in the voice of his characters, as a novelist might sometimes do, but just as this authorial presence in the text, just inserting his philosophical views about things. And so, yes, it's got the traditional novelistic features of fictional characters, and plot and conflict and setting and all that sort of thing. But interwoven in all that are these historical sections, historical analysis sections, philosophical sections, and so forth. And so, in a sense, Winterson is doing that as well, combining these different modes, narrative storytelling with sort of literary analysis, but also sort of personal, reaction to the text, kind of a personal history with the text, that kind of thing. Again, not something you normally would be encouraged to do probably in your typical writing workshop or whatever, but it certainly is a thing that can be done. The other example I wanted to turn to here before I stop yammering at you is to talk about Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian author, very interesting writer, very erudite. So yes, wrote fiction, yes, wrote fantasy, science fiction, but also was very much into medieval literature, did a lot of really interesting writing about Beowulf, but largely interested in Shakespeare. And in fact, this is, by the way, this is the collected fictions translated by Andrew Hurley, put out by Penguin Classics Editions. It's a thickish book, but in the collection, which was published in 1983, titled Shakespeare's Memory, there is a there is the title story, Shakespeare's Memory, which is interesting, kind of fantasy tale about a Shakespearean scholar who is given Shakespeare's memory. The idea is that ever since the days of the bard, like his memory is like this thing that can be passed on from one person to the next, and just by sort of happenstance, this scholar who's really devoted to Shakespeare becomes in possession of Shakespeare's memory, but like his childhood memories and his adult memories, not necessarily important stuff in relation to the plays necessarily, but just literally what he remembered as a human being. And so that's what the story is about. It's interesting. But another piece in that collection I want to actually refer to in a more perhaps useful kind of way is this story, just titled with the date, August 25th, 1983. And the premise of the story is that Borges himself is a character, the character, the main character in the story. He goes into a hotel to register. This is the old-fashioned way of registering, where they have a book on the desk, and you just write your name and the date and so forth. No computers. And as he goes to write his name in the registration book, he sees his name, and he's like already there, and he knows exactly what room he is in. And so he goes up to the room, and it is him as an old man. In fact, an old man who is on his deathbed. And so younger Borges has a conversation with the very, very old, about to die Borges. And one of the things that old dying Borges does is talk about actual events in Borges' life and what Borges thought they meant at the time, and what, in retrospect, all these years later, they actually meant. And so it's really a memoir, because Borges was older when he wrote this. And so it's really a memoir reflecting on his life and so forth, as you would traditionally in a first person, autobiography, a memoir, whatever you want to call it, talking about past events, kind of reevaluating them, and so forth and so on. But it's within the context of this fictive narrative where old dying Borges is talking to younger Borges, and so on. So it's a more interesting, perhaps more engaging way for Borges to write a memoir piece than simply to write a first-person, straightforward memoir piece, right? So, again, I wanted to share that mainly because it's another example of fusing genres together, right? Fusing a typical kind of short story with autobiography, but kind of overt autobiography, not just sort of slipped in there, silently, as authors often do, but very overtly. And again, Winterson is doing that in The Gap of Time by inserting her own thoughts and ideas and feelings about the Winter's Tale along with this novel, which is a revision of The Winter's Tale. And like I said, I think it's appropriate for a revision of The Winter's Tale because of the fact Shakespeare was fusing genres, the tragedy with the comedy, and this sort of hybrid text and so forth. Also appropriate because we know Shakespeare's actors would have engaged directly with the audience, kind of come out of character, if you will, or as characters engage with the audience, however you want to talk about it. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of share all that with you about metafictive techniques. Again, very popular during the postmodern era, but they certainly are not gone, just as they were not invented. They were not given birth during the postmodern era. They did not die and go away with the postmodern era either. We certainly could think about using them today, whether it's a William Gass approach of sharing with our reader our thought processes as a writer as we're telling the narrative, or coming out of the text to engage the reader directly about things, weaving our autobiography into the text in a much more overt way than we might normally do. And as always, the possibilities are endless. So as you think about your own writing, think about how you might fuse genres together. I'm sorry, one other example I meant to share with you, and it's a good one, so I'll go ahead and stick it here at the end. Maybe it's a good one to end on. I mentioned Vonnegut earlier in his Breakfast of Champions. When you talk about fusing genres, maybe one of the very best examples is Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. In that, as you know, it is part autobiography, it is part Kurt Vonnegut, the person who had been a prisoner of war during World War II and was in a concentration camp in prisoner of war camp, I should say, in Dresden, Germany, when Dresden was firebombed by the Allies, and Vonnegut, as a prisoner, was forced to collect bodies and body parts after the attack. And so, again, very young man, that made quite an impression on him. And so, part of Slaughterhouse 5 is his story about being, a prisoner of war and his experiences as a prisoner of war, but fused then with this very bizarre science fiction story about Billy Pilgrim who gets abducted by aliens, and on and on and on. So fusing of the science fiction with memoir comes together in highly popular Slaughterhouse-5. So again, there's really no limitations to what you can kind of bring together. It's just a matter of imagination, what appeals to you. All right, so I will stop on that note, and I will see you down the digital road.